The morning sun cast long shadows across the Dakota plains when Samuel first heard the desperate knocking at his cabin door. He had been sitting at his wooden table, sipping coffee from a chipped ceramic mug and planning his day's work on the ranch. The sound was urgent but soft, like someone trying to make noise while staying hidden. Samuel was a man of 42 years, weathered by the harsh frontier life but still strong from years of cattle herding and fence building. His calloused hands had built this small ranch from nothing, and his gray eyes had seen enough trouble to know when it was coming. The knocking came again, more frantic this time. When he opened the heavy oak door, Samuel found himself looking down at a young Lakota girl who couldn't have been more than 16 years old. Her long black hair was tangled with burrs and dust, and her traditional buckskin dress was torn in several places. Most striking were her dark eyes, wide with terror and darting constantly over her shoulder toward the eastern horizon. "May I hide here until the raiders pass?" she whispered in broken English, her voice shaking like autumn leaves in the wind. Her small hands clutched a beaded pouch against her chest, and Samuel could see scratches on her arms where thorns had caught her during what must have been a desperate flight. Samuel gave a quiet nod without hesitation. Something in the girl's face told him everything he needed to know about the danger she was fleeing. He had heard the stories from other ranchers about the band of outlaws that had been terrorizing settlements and Lakota camps alike, taking whatever they wanted and leaving destruction in their wake. "Come inside, quickly," Samuel said, stepping back to let her enter. The girl moved like a frightened deer, every muscle ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. She glanced around his simple cabin, taking in the stone fireplace, the rough-hewn furniture, and the rifle mounted above the mantel. "They killed my grandmother," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out in a rush. "They burned our camp. I ran all night." Her English was better than Samuel had first thought, though she spoke with the careful precision of someone using a second language. Samuel felt a cold anger settle in his chest. He had known Mary Crow Feather, the girl's grandmother, from his occasional trading visits to the Lakota settlement. She had been a kind woman who always offered him tea and spoke fondly of her granddaughter who was learning to read English from a traveling missionary. "What's your name, child?" Samuel asked gently, moving to the window to scan the horizon. She replied, which Samuel knew meant eternal blossom in her language, "Crow Feather." The name suited her despite her current bedraggled state. Even frightened and dirty, there was something resilient about this girl, something that reminded Samuel of the wild flowers that bloomed defiantly in the harsh prairie soil. "You're safe here," Samuel said, though he was already calculating how many rounds he had for his rifle and whether his old army Colt was still reliable. "Tell me about these raiders. How many were there?" Sank onto the wooden chair near his table, her legs finally giving out after what must have been hours of running. "7 men," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe 8. They had painted faces like warriors, but they were not warriors. They were devils." Samuel had encountered these men before, though only in stories told by other settlers. They called themselves the Blood Creek Gang, led by a former Confederate soldier named Jake who had gone mad somewhere in the war's aftermath. They raided indiscriminately, taking horses, cattle, and anything else of value. But lately, the stories had grown darker. "They took my little brother," continued, and Samuel saw tears begin to trace clean lines through the dust on her cheeks. "Tommy, he's only 8 winters old. They said they would sell him to traders going west." The cold anger in Samuel's chest blazed into fury. Child slavery was the lowest form of evil he could imagine, and he had seen enough evil in his 30-year-old memories of the Civil War to know the depths men could sink to. "Did they see which direction you ran?" Samuel asked, checking his rifle and counting cartridges. Shook her head. "I hid in the tall grass until dark. Then I remembered your cabin from when grandmother brought me to trade. She said you were a good man, not like the others who spit when they see us." Samuel's ranch was isolated, sitting in a valley between 2 low hills about 15 miles from the nearest town. He had chosen the location specifically because it offered good grazing for cattle and a natural water source, but also because it was far enough from civilization that he didn't have to deal with the prejudices and complications of town life. The irony wasn't lost on him that his isolation, which had been a way to avoid the racial tensions of the frontier, was now what made him a potential refuge for this terrified Lakota girl. "You did right to come here," Samuel said, moving to his small pantry and pulling out some dried beef and hardtack. Eat something, you'll need your strength. As nibbled at the food, Samuel considered his options. He could try to take her to town, but that would mean traveling in the open where the raiders might spot them. He could try to contact the cavalry, but the nearest fort was 2 days' ride away. Or he could stand his ground and hope the raiders didn't track to his cabin. "Mister," said suddenly, using his name though he didn't remember telling it to her. "Grandmother spoke of you often. She said you helped her son when he was wounded by bad white men 3 years ago." Samuel remembered that incident clearly. He had found Joseph Crow Feather bleeding by the river, victim of a beating by drunk cowboys from a nearby ranch. Samuel had brought the man home, tended his wounds, and later against the cowboys when they were brought to trial. It had made him some enemies in town, but it had been the right thing to do. "Your grandmother was a wise woman," Samuel said. "I was sorry to hear about her passing, even if it wasn't from old age as it should have been." Through the window, Samuel could see dust clouds on the eastern horizon. His heart began to beat faster as he realized they might not be alone for much longer. The raiders might have picked up trail after all. He said quietly, "I want you to go to the root cellar behind the cabin. There's a hidden door under the old saddle blanket. Stay there no matter what you hear, understand?" The girl's eyes widened with fresh terror. "They're coming." "Maybe," Samuel said, lifting his rifle from above the fireplace and checking the action. "But I want you to know something. Whatever happens, I won't let them take you. I promise you that." Stood slowly, her young face showing a composure that seemed far beyond her years. "If they find me, tell them I went north toward the river. Tell them I stole your horse." Samuel was struck by her courage and her concern for his safety, even in her own desperate situation. This was no ordinary 16-year-old girl, but someone who had been shaped by the hard realities of frontier life and the recent tragedy that had claimed her family. The dust clouds were getting closer, and Samuel could make out individual riders now. 7 men, just as had said, riding hard and following what looked like a trail that led directly toward his cabin. "Go now," Samuel told, "and remember what I said, stay hidden no matter what." As the girl slipped out the back door toward the root cellar, Samuel stood alone in his cabin, rifle in hand, and prepared to face whatever evil was riding toward his home. He thought about the promise he had made to a terrified Lakota girl, and he knew that some promises were worth dying for. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, and Samuel stepped out onto his front porch to meet whatever fate was coming down the trail. The 7 riders pulled up in front of Samuel's cabin in a cloud of dust and the smell of sweating horses. Their leader, a tall man with a face and cold blue eyes, dismounted slowly while the others remained in their saddles. Samuel recognized him immediately from the descriptions he had heard. Jake, the Confederate veteran who had lost his mind somewhere in the hell of war. Wore a tattered gray coat that might have once been a uniform, and his hat was pulled low over eyes that held no warmth or humanity. The men with him were a mixture of drifters, deserters, and criminals, united only by their willingness to follow into whatever darkness he led them toward. "Morning, rancher," said, his voice carrying a false politeness that fooled no one. "Nice little spread you got here, peaceful, quiet." His eyes swept over the cabin, the corrals, and the surrounding landscape with the calculating gaze of a predator sizing up territory. Samuel kept his rifle pointed down but ready, his finger resting lightly on the trigger guard. "Morning. You boys look like you've been riding hard. Water's free if you need it for your horses." It was a careful offer, one that acknowledged their presence without showing either fear or hostility. Samuel had learned during his war years that sometimes the best way to handle dangerous men was to give them what they expected while revealing nothing of what you were really thinking. One of the other riders, a thin man with nervous eyes and tobacco-stained teeth, leaned forward in his saddle. "We ain't here for water, old man. We're tracking a little Indian girl, young thing probably scared out of her mind. You seen anything like that?" Samuel's face remained impassive, though inside he felt his anger growing. These men spoke of like she was an animal they were hunting, not a terrified child who had lost everything. "Can't say I have," Samuel replied. "Been working cattle since before dawn, haven't seen much of anything except my own stock." Stepped closer, and Samuel could smell the whiskey on his breath despite the early hour. The man's hand rested casually on the grip of his pistol, a gesture that was meant to be both casual and threatening. "See, that's interesting," said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Because we followed a trail that leads right to your front door. Little footprints in the soft ground by the creek, running fast like someone in a hurry." Samuel shrugged, maintaining his calm exterior while his mind raced through possibilities. Might have been anything. Coyotes come through here regular, sometimes deer if the water's low elsewhere. The lie came easily, but Samuel could see that wasn't buying it. The raider leader's eyes had the cunning of someone who had survived by reading people's tells and weaknesses. He was studying Samuel's face, looking for cracks in the facade. "Mind if we take a look around?" asked, though it clearly wasn't really a question. "Just to put our minds at ease. See, this little Indian girl, she's got something that belongs to us." "What kind of something?" Samuel asked, genuinely curious despite the danger of the situation. Another rider, a bearded man with a star tattooed on his forehead, spat into the dust. "Her grandmother had a map. Shows where the tribe hid their gold before they moved to the reservation. Girl probably grabbed it when she ran." Samuel almost smiled at the absurdity of it. These men had murdered innocent people and were now hunting a child based on the ridiculous notion that a poor Lakota settlement had hidden gold. But he had seen enough desperate men to know that logic played no part in their thinking. "Can't stop you from looking," Samuel said, stepping aside but keeping his rifle ready. "But I'll be watching while you do it." Nodded to his men, and 3 of them dismounted while the others kept their weapons trained on Samuel. The search was thorough and destructive. They overturned his furniture, scattered his belongings, and even prodded the ashes in his fireplace looking for signs of recent use that might indicate he had been harboring someone. Samuel watched it all with growing anger, but he forced himself to remain calm. Every minute they spent searching his cabin was another minute that remained hidden and safe. He only hoped she would have the courage to stay in the root cellar no matter what she heard. "Nothing in the cabin, boss," one of the men reported after they had finished their search. "But there's other buildings." Samuel's heart sank as he realized they would want to search his barn, his tool shed, and eventually, if they were thorough enough, they might discover the root cellar where was hiding. "Barn's just got hay and tools," Samuel said. "Shed's got winter supplies, nothing that would interest you boys." Studied him for a long moment, then smiled with no warmth. "You know what I think, rancher? I think you're lying. I think you know exactly where that little Indian girl is." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, and Samuel felt the moment when pretense was stripped away and the real confrontation began. These men hadn't come just to search his property. They had come prepared for violence, and Samuel realized that whether he cooperated or not, they weren't planning to leave any witnesses. "Think whatever you want," Samuel said, raising his rifle slightly. "But you've searched my cabin and found nothing. Time for you to move on." Laughed, a sound that held no humor. "Oh, we're not going anywhere yet. See, even if the girl isn't here now, she might come back, especially if she thinks you're her friend." The plan became clear to Samuel with horrible certainty. They intended to wait, to use him as bait to draw out of hiding. And once they had her, they would kill them both to eliminate any witnesses to their crimes. "You boys are making a mistake," Samuel said quietly. "I served with the 14th Infantry during the war, killed more men than I like to remember. You might get me, but I'll take some of you with me." It was both a warning and a challenge, spoken in the calm voice of a man who had faced death before and wasn't afraid to do so again. Samuel could see the calculation in his eyes as the raider leader weighed the cost of a fight against the potential reward. "Maybe so," said finally, "but we've got you outnumbered 7-1, and we've got nothing but time." That was when Samuel heard the sound that changed everything, a child's cough coming from somewhere behind the cabin. It was barely audible, probably caused by dust in the root cellar, but in the tense silence it might as well have been a gunshot. His head turned toward the sound like a hunting dog catching a scent. His smile became genuinely pleased for the first time since his arrival. "Well, well," he said softly, "sounds like our little bird has come home to roost." Samuel knew that the time for pretense was over. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, he made the decision that would determine whether he lived or died. His finger moved to the trigger of his rifle as he prepared to make good on the promise he had given to a frightened Lakota girl. The morning sun climbed higher over the Dakota plains as 7 armed men and 1 determined rancher prepared for a confrontation that would be remembered in the territory for years to come. Hidden in the root cellar, Crowfeather pressed her hand to her mouth and prayed to the spirits of her ancestors for the courage that would be needed in the next few minutes. Samuel didn't hesitate when Jake turned toward the sound of scoff. In one fluid motion born from years of frontier living and war experience, he brought his rifle to his shoulder and fired. The bullet caught in the left shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the hitching post. The gunshot shattered the morning quiet and sent the horses rearing and whinnying in panic. Samuel threw himself behind a water trough as the remaining 6 raiders opened fire, their bullets splintering the wood around him and sending chunks of stone flying from the cabin wall behind him. "Kill him," screamed from where he lay clutching his wounded shoulder. "Find that girl and kill them both." Samuel rolled to his left and came up firing, his second shot taking one of the mounted raiders clean out of his saddle. But the odds were still heavily against him, and he knew that his position behind the water trough wouldn't protect him for long against 6 determined. Bullets continued to tear into his makeshift cover, and Samuel could hear the raiders spreading out to flank him from both sides. He had maybe 20 rounds left for his rifle and 6 shots in his army Colt. Against 6 experienced killers, it might not be enough. That was when he heard the war cry. It came from the hills to the north, a sound that made every man in the fight freeze for a moment. It was followed by another cry, and then another, until the air was filled with the voices of Lakota warriors announcing their presence to the world. Joseph Crowfeather appeared first, riding down from the hills with his war paint fresh and his rifle ready. Behind him came 7 other warriors, men whose families had also been victims of the Blood Creek Gang's raid. They had been tracking the raiders just as the raiders had been tracking, following a trail of destruction that led inevitably to this moment of reckoning. "The cavalry!" one of the raiders shouted in panic, mistaking the war cries for military signals. "No, you fool!" yelled, struggling to his feet despite his wounded shoulder. "It's the Indians, they followed us." The arrival of the Lakota warriors changed the entire dynamic of the fight. Suddenly, the Blood Creek Gang found themselves caught between Samuel's position and 8 mounted warriors who were riding down on them with the fury of men seeking justice for murdered families. Samuel used the distraction to his advantage, rising from behind the water trough and putting a bullet through the chest of the raider who had been trying to flank him from the left. The man dropped his weapon and fell face first into the dusty ground. Joseph Crowfeather's rifle boomed, and another raider toppled from his horse. The remaining members of the gang tried to mount a coordinated defense, but they were demoralized and outnumbered. These weren't the helpless families they were used to terrorizing, but seasoned fighters who knew exactly what they were fighting for. The thin man with tobacco-stained teeth tried to run for his horse, but one of the Lakota warriors rode him down with a war club, ending his flight permanently. The bearded man with the star tattoo managed to get mounted and tried to flee toward the eastern hills, but 2 warriors pursued him, and Samuel never saw him again. In less than 5 minutes, the fight was over. 5 of the 7 raiders lay dead in the dust around Samuel's cabin, and Jake sat propped against the hitching post with his hands raised in surrender, blood seeping through the fingers he held pressed to his wounded shoulder. "Don't shoot," pleaded as Joseph Crowfeather approached him with a raised tomahawk. "I surrender. I claim the protection of white man's law." Joseph paused and looked at Samuel, who was emerging from behind the water trough with his rifle still ready. The Lakota warrior's face was grim with the memory of what this man had done to their peaceful settlement. "What do you say?" Joseph asked in perfect English. "Does this dog deserve the white man's law?" Samuel considered the question while reloading his rifle. He thought about cowering in the root cellar, about her murdered grandmother, about her little brother who was still missing and might never be found. "The law says every man deserves a trial," Samuel said finally. "Even dogs like this one." It was then that emerged from her hiding place, having heard the gunfire stop and the familiar voices of her own people. She ran to Joseph Crowfeather, who gathered her into his arms with the gentle relief of a man who had feared he would never see his niece alive again. "Uncle Joseph," she cried, reverting to her native language in her excitement and relief. Then, remembering Samuel's sacrifice, she turned to him with tears streaming down her face. "He kept his promise. He protected me even when they would have killed him for it." Joseph Crowfeather looked at Samuel with new respect in his dark eyes. This white rancher had risked everything to protect a Lakota girl he barely knew and had fought beside them against their common enemies. "You are a brave man, Samuel," Joseph said formally. "My people will not forget what you have done." Samuel nodded acknowledgement, but his mind was on practical matters. What about the boy's brother? Still bleeding and hopping to buy himself some mercy, spoke up quickly. "The kid's with our camp about 10 miles south near Devil's Creek. 3 men guarding him and maybe a dozen stolen horses. I can show you where." "Why should we believe you?" one of the other warriors asked, raising his rifle threateningly. "Because I want to live," said simply. "And because the boy's no good to us dead, we were planning to sell him to traders heading for California." Joseph Crow Feather conferred quickly with his men in Lakota, then turned back to Samuel and, "We will take him with us to find the boy. If he lies, he dies slowly. If he tells the truth, we turn him over to the soldiers at Fort for trial." Samuel agreed to accompany them, partly to ensure that kept his word and partly because he felt responsible for seeing this through to the end. Insisted on coming as well, despite the protests of her uncle. "Tommy is my little brother," she said firmly. "He will be frightened. He will need to see a familiar face when we find him." As they prepared to ride toward Devil's Creek, Samuel reflected on how quickly his quiet morning had turned into a life-changing battle. He had woken up as a simple rancher planning to mend fences and check on his cattle. Now he was riding with Lakota warriors to rescue a kidnapped child and deliver a notorious outlaw to military justice. But as he looked at riding beside her uncle, her young face showing the strength and determination that had helped her survive the night of terror, Samuel knew he had made the right choice. Some promises were indeed worth dying for, and some fights were worth fighting regardless of the odds. The sun was climbing toward midday as the strange party, 8 Lakota warriors, 1 white rancher, 1 terrified prisoner, and 1 brave Lakota girl, rode south toward Devil's Creek and whatever confrontation awaited them there. Behind them, the bodies of the Blood Creek gang lay scattered around Samuel's cabin, a grim reminder of the price of justice on the frontier. In her beaded pouch, still carried the small Bible her grandmother had treasured, its pages filled with pressed wildflowers and the wisdom of 2 cultures learning to coexist. It was all she had left of her old life, but as she rode toward an uncertain future, she carried something new as well, the knowledge that there were still good people in the world willing to risk everything for strangers in need. The ride to Devil's Creek took them through some of the most beautiful and dangerous country in the Dakota Territory. Red rock formations rose from the prairie like ancient monuments, and hidden canyons cut deep into the earth where water had carved its path over countless years. It was perfect country for outlaws to hide, but it was also perfect country for warriors who knew how to move silently through broken terrain. Jake led them true to his word, though Joseph Crow Feather kept a rope around the man's neck and a warrior with a rifle trained on him at all times. The outlaw leader seemed to understand that his only chance for survival lay in complete cooperation, and he answered every question about his gang's habits and hiding places with desperate honesty. "They'll have the boy in the main camp," explained as they approached Devil's Creek. "3 men, like I said, but they ain't expecting trouble. Figured the rest of us would be back by evening with the girl and whatever gold she might have been carrying." Samuel had to bite back his anger at the casual way spoke of kidnapping and murder. The man showed no remorse for what he had done, only concern for his own survival. It was a reminder of how completely some men could lose their humanity in the aftermath of war and hardship. Rode close to Samuel, her young face tight with worry for her brother, but also with determination to see this through. She had been quiet during most of the ride, but Samuel could see her gathering her courage for whatever lay ahead. "What if they've hurt Tommy?" she asked quietly in English, not wanting the warriors to hear her fears. "Then we'll deal with that when we find him," Samuel replied honestly. "But your brother's more valuable to them unhurt. Men like these, they think only about profit. They won't damage something they plan to sell." It was harsh comfort, but it was realistic and nodded her understanding. She had grown up fast in the past day, forced by circumstances to face adult realities that no 16-year-old should have to confront. Joseph Crow Feather signaled for the group to dismount and proceed on foot as they neared the outlaw camp. The smell of wood smoke drifted through the air, and Samuel could hear the distant sound of horses moving restlessly in a makeshift corral. "3 guards," whispered, pointing toward the camp. "Carson's got a bad leg from an old gunshot, so he won't move fast. Billy's young but stupid, and Pete's mean but drinks too much during the day. The boy will be tied up near the main fire. Joseph divided his warriors into two groups, sending 4 men to circle around and approach the camp from the west while he led the others in from the east. Samuel was assigned to stay with and guard, though he suspected the real reason was to keep the white man out of what might become a very personal form of justice. The attack came just after noon, swift and coordinated like the strike of a hunting pack. The 3 guards barely had time to reach for their weapons before they found themselves surrounded by painted warriors who had appeared as silently as spirits. "Don't move," Joseph shouted in English, his rifle trained on a thin man with a pronounced limp. "Drop your weapons and you might live to see another sunrise." The man called Carson seemed inclined to fight, but his companions were quicker to read the situation. They threw down their guns and raised their hands, while Carson stood frozen between defiance and surrender. That was when Samuel heard the sound that made his heart race with relief, a young boy's voice calling out in Lakota from near the campfire. Tommy Crow Feather was alive, and from the sound of his voice, unharmed. Didn't wait for permission. She broke from her position and ran toward her brother, dodging between the startled outlaws and surprised warriors. Samuel followed her, keeping his rifle ready in case any of the guards decided to make a desperate play. Tommy was tied to a cottonwood tree near the fire, his small face streaked with tears but his eyes bright with hope when he saw his sister running toward him. He was thin and dirty, but Samuel could see no obvious signs of serious harm. Tommy cried, switching to English as his sister worked to untie the ropes that bound him. "They said they killed everyone. They said you were dead." "I'm here, little brother," said, her own tears flowing freely as she pulled Tommy into her arms. "I'm here and you're safe now. Uncle Joseph and the warriors came to find us." Samuel watched the reunion with a mixture of relief and sadness. These children had lost their grandmother and their home, but they still had each other and the love of their extended family. It was more than many frontier orphans could claim. Joseph Crow Feather approached the 3 captured guards with the cold efficiency of a man administering justice. "You will tell me where the rest of the stolen goods are hidden," he said calmly. "You will tell me which direction the other raiders fled, and you will tell me if there are any other captives being held by your gang." The questioning was thorough, and Samuel suspected, more gentle than these men deserved. By evening, the warriors had recovered most of the stolen horses and goods that the Blood Creek gang had accumulated during their recent raids. More importantly, they had confirmed that Tommy and were the only captives, and that the remaining members of the gang had scattered to the 4 winds after the fight at Samuel's ranch. As the sun began to set over Devil's Creek, Samuel found himself sitting by the campfire with and Tommy, while the warriors prepared for the journey back to their temporary camp. The children were exhausted but happy, and Samuel felt a deep satisfaction at seeing them reunited and safe. "What will you do now?" Samuel asked as she combed the tangles from her brother's hair with careful fingers. "Uncle Joseph says we will go to live with our cousins on the Pine Ridge Reservation," she replied. "There is a school there where Tommy and I can continue learning to read and write in English. Grandmother always said education would help us build bridges between our people and yours." Samuel nodded thoughtfully. The reservation system was far from perfect, but it offered security and the chance for these children to build a new life from the ashes of their tragedy. "What about you, mister?" asked. "Will you go back to your ranch?" Samuel looked out across the darkening prairie toward his distant home. The cabin would need repairs from the bullet damage, and he would have to replace the furniture that had been destroyed during the search. But it was still home, still the life he had chosen for himself. "I reckon so," he said. "Though I suspect I'll have more visitors now. Your uncle has invited me to visit your people whenever I'm in the area." It was true. Joseph Crow Feather had extended an unprecedented invitation for Samuel to visit their camps and participate in their trading relationships. It was a mark of respect that few white men had ever earned, and Samuel intended to honor it. 3 days later, Samuel stood on the porch of his repaired cabin and watched the dust cloud raised by a cavalry patrol escorting Jake and his surviving gang members to fort for trial. The outlaw leader had kept his word about the location of the stolen goods and captives, but Samuel doubted that would save him from the gallows. In his pocket, Samuel carried a letter written in careful English script, telling him that she and Tommy were settling in well with their cousins, and that she was already helping to teach English to younger children at the reservation school. She had signed it, "Your friend always, Crow Feather," and had included a pressed wildflower as a remembrance. As the sun set over his peaceful valley, Samuel reflected on how a single moment of moral choice could change the course of many lives. He had opened his door to a frightened Lakota girl and found himself part of a story that would connect two families and two cultures in ways that would last for generations. The Dakota Plains stretched endlessly in all directions, holding secrets and stories and the promise of new beginnings for those brave enough to write them. And somewhere on the Pine Ridge Reservation, a young Lakota woman was teaching children that courage could be found in the most unlikely places, and that sometimes the best thing a person could do was simply open their door when someone knocked and asked for help. Samuel went inside his cabin, hung his rifle above the fireplace, and began planning his next visit to see how and Tommy were doing in their new life. Some promises, he had learned, were worth keeping forever.